Hello mate, my name's Gareth and welcome to Eno Wrestling. This is the second video in a 3-part series looking at the fundamentals of storytelling within the context of pro wrestling. The first video is up on my channel now, so it might be an idea to watch that before this if you haven't already. In that video, I go over the 4 pillars of storytelling and how they translate into pro wrestling. Today though, we're going to be looking at the 10 key elements of storytelling through the lens of CM Punk vs Eddie Kingston from AEW Full Gear. Eddie vs Punk got plenty of shouts for Match of the Year. Now, whether you agree with that or disagree is not really the point. The point is that the match and this feud connected to many fans in a way that few others did. Most of the people I've seen saying how much they adore this match can't actually explain why they love it so much. But I do know why. It's because Eddie Kingston vs CM Punk is pro wrestling at its simple best. It's the perfect example of short-term storytelling and how that builds into individual long-term character arcs. Characterization is how we as an audience differentiate characters from each other. It's how they stand out as individuals. It's everything we know about a character. It gives characters complexities which allows us to understand and empathize with them. How do they act? What drives them to act that way? Where do they come from? How do they speak? What do they like? What do they dislike? And so on. In the last video, I spoke about how characters allow us to invest in stories. Well, characterization is how we invest in characters. It's always good to draw on any history that 2 characters share, as this allows the characterization of the 2 wrestlers to inform the story that they're telling. Eddie Kingston drew on how CM Punk was previously a big fish in a small pond on the indies, and how he once looked up to Punk. Eddie even says that Punk was a hero of his, but after seeing how he judged those below him, particularly Eddie himself, he changed his mind. This tells us not only how Eddie feels about Punk, but it shows what kind of a man Eddie is. Not just a guy who fights for himself, but someone who fights for his vision of justice and for the little guy. Punk, meanwhile, spoke about why he doesn't respect Eddie Kingston. He speaks about how he once saw potential greatness in Eddie, but was a fool to hold him to that standard because, when it comes down to it, Eddie is a bum. The history between these two informs their rivalry and grudge with each other. It's their individual roads since then that makes this point in their arcs a boiling point. There are 2 other aspects of characterization that are vital to this feud in particular. The 2 men's pettiness and their individual flaws, but I'll come back to those later in the video. Motive is the character's short-term goal and the driving force behind short-term storytelling. Motive is important because it drives every single decision and action that a character makes. Motives can oftentimes be very petty, just like it was for Eddie Kingston and CM Punk to begin their feud. As I spoke about in characterization, both Eddie and Punk are very petty characters. They won't let things that they see as injustice slide, even if it's not that important. Their feud started when Eddie, frustrated after his loss against Bryan Danielson, interrupted CM Punk's interview time. Eddie saw a smile from Punk as he walked by, which he took as the same condescending attitude Punk has always shown towards Eddie in his mind. Punk, meanwhile, was insulted that his mic time had been interrupted. It's incredibly petty stuff, but that doesn't make it any less compelling. Walter White in Breaking Bad is one of the pettiest characters of all time, but he's also one of the best. There are motives involved in every single story beat, and they might change over time, but it is perhaps most important in the beginning of a story, because this is how the character and their overall arc informs the story being told in the short term. Objective is the character's long-term goal, maybe even as much as their career goal in the context of pro wrestling or their overall life goal in other forms of storytelling. Oftentimes this can be an unspoken goal and is not necessarily always achieved. For most wrestlers, it's very common for their objective to be becoming the world champion. For a wrestler like Bryan Danielson, who has achieved that a fair few times, his objective might be to prove that he's the greatest of all time. For both Eddie Kingston and CM Punk, their objective is becoming the world champion, but for very different reasons. Punk wants to win the world title to prove that he's still as good as he was. He's driven by the 7 years he lost from pro wrestling. He's driven by the anxiety of, what if I haven't got it anymore? Becoming a world champion proves that, in fact, he has still got it. This is the kind of mentality where a character could very easily lean into by any means necessary as a justification to achieve their objective, and Punk leans into that mentality during the match with Eddie. For Eddie Kingston, however, he's driven to win the world title not just to prove that he's good enough, but to prove to his mother, friends, the ones he's lost and his peers that all his sacrifices were worth it. This is why it's much harder for Eddie to sacrifice his code of honour for that one moment of glory. And this is exactly why Eddie Kingston refuses to bow down, kiss CM Punk's feet and apologise, because he can't respect how Punk acted back in the day, and he can't respect how he acts now. Eddie's motivation somewhat contradicts his objective, because he's disregarding what he wants in order to fight for what he believes in. The result of this match isn't important to Eddie, because his legacy will not be about being the best. It will be about being unapologetically himself and proving that he, as himself, is good enough. Stakes are the things that characters are set to gain or lose on their journey to achieving their motivations and objectives. Stakes inform the drama and should exist in every single beat of a story. If there are no stakes, there really is no drama. This is why the wins and losses matter mantra is so important, and the reason why AEW storytelling is, objectively, so much better than WWE's. Having said that, Eddie Kingston throws those stakes out of the window by saying that he doesn't even care if he wins or loses, because teaching Punk a lesson is worth taking a loss on his record, and worth the setback in his quest for gold. Don't be fooled into thinking this is lazy storytelling though. For many characters it might be, but Eddie Kingston's conviction and motive is so strong that it actually raises the stakes from merely a match to a grudge fight. Materially, Eddie has nothing at stake. Ideologically, however, he's putting everything on the line to prove his point. Meanwhile, CM Punk claims that it is exactly this attitude which holds Eddie Kingston back. Punk's stakes are not just that he needs to win for the sake of his rankings, but that he must win to prove that he is right. But above all of that, Punk feels that he needs to win in order to prove that Eddie is wrong in his assessment of Punk. Because if Punk loses, he may just lose the respect of the fans as well. As the war of words and match itself go on, it is hinted at more and more that Eddie may, in fact, be correct. Is Punk just a selfish man who manipulates the audience into adoration? Time will tell. Conflict is the challenge that characters must overcome in order to achieve their motives and objectives. Characters must confront their conflict in order to succeed or fail, and, most importantly, change. Conflict helps to create tension in the story and exists to draw us as the audience in and care about the character's journey. There are 4 main types of conflict in storytelling. Most of these are common in wrestling, except for a character's conflict with nature. This is something that is difficult to achieve in the world of pro wrestling, so much so that I can't even think of an example. The other forms are a character's inner conflict, as we saw executed perfectly in Hangman's character arc, as well as a character's conflict with wider society, for example Pac's disdain with absolutely everything in AEW in 2019 and early 2020, and most commonly, a character's conflict with another character. This is what we get from CM Punk vs Eddie Kingston. This is the story of 2 men's issue with each other, and one which builds into both men's wider character arcs. In Eddie Kingston vs CM Punk, the source of the conflict is informed by their shared history on the indies and by Eddie's failings against Bryan Danielson. Eddie takes out his frustration by interrupting Punk, and Punk takes issue to that. That may seem too simple or overly petty, but when you're dealing with 2 very petty individuals, with their shared history and mic skills that these 2 have, it's actually all you need. These 2 men don't like each other and want to fight. Can it be that simple? With all the other added layers to this story which I'm explaining throughout this video, yes. Yes it can. Pisces. Character dynamic is essentially just the relationship between different characters. Why are they involved with each other in the story? Is that informed by their history? What does that mean moving forward? And so on. The timing of when characters meet each other in a story is vital to their dynamic. Why are these 2 characters coming together at this point? What does that say about their individual character arcs at this stage? 2 characters coming together at the wrong time can break a story because the dynamic between them has to maintain over the entire narrative. For Eddie Kingston vs CM Punk, there's various reasons why they had the perfect character dynamic, especially in that moment where they first met backstage on Rampage. It clicked immediately and just felt right. It became obvious why it felt right during their promo battle on the following Rampage. The two men share history and different perspectives on things, made for the perfect, simple conflict that I just spoke about. Eddie Kingston has become what Punk was in WWE, the outsider, someone who's never supposed to make it, who fights for the little guy and is the voice of the fans. CM Punk, meanwhile, maybe hadn't quite become John Cena, but he was close enough for the story. He'd become what he once hated, the megastar who claims to speak for the fans. Character dynamics shift and change throughout a story, and that's what makes for epic rivalries that grow and change over time within pro wrestling. When, or if, Punk and Eddie ever meet again, this feud will inform the next meeting to make their dynamic feel different and unique. That is why, despite many people wanting this feud to immediately continue, it is sometimes better to let it marinate.
Is that okay with you? Because it's not okay with me.
Character purpose is the role a character plays in a story and how that role functions to inform the narrative. All characters are plot devices, vessels for the story to travel through. It's just that some characters are more meaningful to the story than others. For example, when we look at Hangman's story in AEW, the Elite are the antagonists, Hangman is the protagonist, the Good Brothers exist to provide obstacles for Hangman, and the Dark Order serve the role of helping Hangman. It's all very simple, but effective storytelling. Some characters change throughout the narrative. We call these dynamic or active characters. These are the main characters who are truly worth investing in. Some don't change. These are static or passive characters, usually side characters. Every character in a story has their own narrative purpose, and in Eddie Kingston vs CM Punk, this is a feud that served both men's character arcs, and that is what is so beautiful about the dynamic between these two. They're both on their own journey and clash, providing an obstacle for each other. Both performers know their role in each other's stories, and they perfectly use this feud to further each other's character arcs. There's no proper heel and no proper babyface. The fans cheer more for Eddie, but this story, despite its simplicity in many aspects, is incredibly layered in terms of character work. They don't rely on tropes, they rely on feelings, and that is what makes it so easy for the audience to connect to this story. Outcome is extremely important to a story, as it's the destination that the entire narrative builds to. It is the end result. In many cases that might be as simple as win or lose, but as with all storytelling, it's less about what happens and more about what that means for the character. It is for this reason that the end of a story being failure can be a perfectly satisfying ending, particularly in pro wrestling where the story doesn't just end, it keeps evolving. So failure such as a loss can be used to further the wrestler's character arc. In Eddie Kingston vs CM Punk, the surface level outcome is that CM Punk succeeds by winning and that Eddie Kingston fails by losing. But it is more complex than that. In the build to the match, Eddie Kingston said that he doesn't care about winning or losing, he just wants to teach Punk a lesson and expose him for what he really is. This is where I must cut this point short and move on to the next key element, because outcome is only really half of it. The change in a character by the end of their story is more telling than the outcome which exists to signify the change. Change should be self-explanatory, but just to be clear, all stories are about changes within a character, so by the end of a story, or even the end of a chapter of a story, we need to see a change in the character. If there is no change, then there is no story. For Eddie Kingston, his outcome is that he loses, but he takes CM Punk to a place that he hadn't been to in AEW before. Dare I say, he exposed a foreshadowing of CM Punk as a heel character? So, in that sense, he succeeds. Eddie Kingston lost, but he brought the real CM Punk to the surface. This is the epitome of getting over in defeat. For Punk, however, he won, and he takes that win forward with him. But at what cost? He leaned into becoming the kind of person that he once fought against, and when you look at the promo exchange between Eddie and Punk acts like he's entitled to an apology, entitled to respect as a legend of the industry. Has he developed a new flaw in this entitlement? How far would this entitlement run? Does he feel entitled to the AEW World Championship? This feud with Eddie Kingston didn't have quite enough at stake to fully expose Punk, but it had enough to draw something out of him that we hadn't seen before. Would stakes as big as the World Championship be enough to finally fully expose Punk for what we all know that he can be? Time will tell. And also, whilst Eddie proved his point, Punk also proved his by beating Eddie. He proved that Eddie Kingston doesn't focus on his goal, and that's why he continues to fail to win the big matches. This happened again because Eddie let his emotions get the better of him. Has Eddie learned from this loss? Will he change moving forward and focus his head more and win a championship soon? I sure hope he does, but again, only time will tell. The theme of a story is the core topic or message that the narrative explores. Themes are important because they provide the meaning to the story. Every story will have various themes, countless even, but most will centre around one or two that are the absolute heart of the narrative. To me, the key theme from Eddie Kingston vs CM Punk is respect. Eddie Kingston desires the respect of his peers, and the ultimate way of solidifying this is for him to win the World Championship. However, if he gets to the top by scratching and pulling others down, he knows that he won't have the respect of the men in the locker room that he desires. His issue with CM Punk is that lack of respect. The initial thing he takes issue with against Punk is a condescending smile. Something so small but significant because Eddie is so motivated by feeling respect from his peers. This is as bad to Eddie as someone mocking Punk for leaving wrestling for 7 years is to CM Punk. This is why Punk, in his current space, is motivated by respect from the fans. He loves their adoration, but he loves it because he knows it's built on a deep level of respect for his legacy. The one thing tarnishing Punk's legacy is that when he said he was the voice of the voiceless, he actually just walked away from wrestling. Of course, in real life, he had to do that for himself, but when someone suggests he did it because he doesn't care about the fans, this is what hits CM Punk, the character, the hardest. This is why it is the only thing that Eddie says during the entire promo battle that gets Punk to turn to his darker side and headbutt Eddie. A darker side which ultimately saw him lose some respect from the fans as they started to boo him at times during the feud. Eddie Kingston also knew that this is what he had to do to expose the real CM Punk. Respect is so ingrained in both men's characters and motivations. It's what defines the result in this feud, because whilst Eddie Kingston lost the match, he won the respect of the fans and his peers. And while CM Punk won the match, he started to lose some of that respect from the fans. The heart of the conflict is built solely on respect, or perhaps the lack of respect, between the two men and their place in the industry. The stakes of this feud on the surface are a win and a loss, but on a deeper level, it's the respect that both these men crave that's at stake. Ultimately, this is the story of two characters clashing on their opposing ideologies. They will never completely respect each other, but they are human, and this is what makes them so relatable to the fans and fascinating as characters. And this is what makes their feud, culminating at Full Gear, so gripping and feel so real. The brilliance of this story is that you probably already knew most of what I've said in this video. The only thing I've done is put it into the language of story analysis rather than simply feeling, because we as audiences are supposed to feel, not think. It wasn't a story that asked you to think. This was an entertaining, short-term story that perfectly built into long-term character arcs. It was everything it needed to be, and that is why Eddie Kingston vs CM Punk ruled. As I said at the start of the video, this is the second in a 3-part series on storytelling in wrestling. In this video, we looked at a short-term story and broke down the key elements that made it great. In the first video, we explored the 4 pillars of storytelling in wrestling, and in the final video of this series, we will explore how AEW has perfected long-term storytelling. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more AEW content. Cheers, mate.